بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه الطاهرين ما دام ما في السماوات والأرضين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما اللهم إنا نسألك علما ينفعنا ويرفعنا اللهم إنا نسألك علما نافعا ورزقا واسعا وعملا متقبلا وشفاء من كل داء. نوينا التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والاستفادة والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم. وبعد, السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, by the grace and mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have now reached lesson number 131, and this deals with the accommodation for a mu'tadda. We will go directly into the text bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which reads as follows: وَعَلَى الْمُتَوَفَّى عَنْهَا زَوْجُهَا وَالْمَبْتُوتَةُ مُلَازَمَةُ الْبَيْتِ إِلَّا لِحَاجَةٍ. The text reads that it is upon al-mutawaffa anha zawjuha, the wife whose husband has passed away. We are now referring to the widower. Here we find that the Arabic term is fairly long, whilst the English equivalent amounts to one word. وَعَلَى الْمُتَوَفَّى عَنْهَا زَوْجُهَا, and upon the widower. The widower and another category of womenfolk. وَالْمَبْتُوتَةُ. Mabtuta refers to a lady that has been divorced. One of two categories. The one category is she's been divorced thrice over. That's the one category. Or alternatively, there was a khula arrangement. The wife paid for the divorce. The husband issued the divorce. He can't take her back whilst she is in the waiting period. So these are the two types of womenfolk that we are referring to. What is upon them? Upon them is mulazamatul bayt. They need to remain within the home, the marital home, the home in which they are spending their iddah, illa lihajatin. And they may only move out of the home lihajatin when there is a need to do so. Illa lihajatin, except when there's a need to do so. So let us work through the unpacking of this particular part of the text. So a lady in a waiting period, she's either a raja'iyya, which we will be discussing in a moment, but for now we're going to be dealing with al-mutawaffa anha zawjuha wal-mabtuta. We're going to be dealing with the widower and a lady, and for purposes of our class, I'm going to translate it as who has received an irrevocable divorce. We're going to be dealing with these two types of divorcees first. The ruling in relation to the both of them would be as established by the author Abu Shuja. It says يجب على المعتدة ملازمة مسكن العدة. It is necessary for such a lady to remain in the marital home wherein she is spending her waiting period. It is not permissible for her to exit, neither is it permissible to extricate her, to remove her from the home. What is the proof for that? The proof for that is the verse of the Holy Quran wherein Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says لا تخرجوهن من بيوتهن ولا يخرجن. Very simple in terms of the verse. The verse reads that لا تخرجوهن, do not remove them from the marital home. Literally it reads their homes. ولا يخرجن, and neither should they exit. Here's an important note also which Taqiyuddin al-Hisni talks about, and we'll go to that note very quickly inshallah and read through it. It reads as follows: ولو اتفق الزوجان, if the husband and wife agree على أن تنتقل, that she should move إلى منزل الآخر, to another place, بلا عذر, without a valid excuse, لم يجوز, it would not be permissible. You may argue in this particular regard that المسلمون على شروطهم, that Muslims are upon their conditions. So they mutually agree that look, we're not going to spend the waiting period here, we're going to spend it elsewhere. Why is that not valid? It is valid because the waiting period is not the right of the husband or the wife exclusively. Rather, there is an element of the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that particular equation. Al-iddatu haqqun lillah. The waiting period is the right of Allah. So it cannot be dispensed with. So what our scholars argue about here is that from the outset as a concept, you cannot dispense of the waiting period. You cannot dispense of the waiting period. So husband and wife, they decide, I'm divorcing you, but you don't have to spend the waiting period. No, because it's the right of Allah. So like it's not permissible to dispense of the waiting period in its entirety, it's not permissible, our scholars argue, to tamper with the manner in which the waiting period is spent, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We go on to the next chapter, and the next chapter here deals with a need. So we've already established that if there's a need, and then the lady may leave. She's in a waiting period, yes, but if there's a need, she may exit. What is a need? So the need reads as follows. If she fears for a person or she fears for wealth, what does that mean? Fire, drowning or destruction, whether it is a widower or a divorcee. Similarly, our scholars say, لو لم تكن الدار حصينة وخافت اللصوص. If the house is not secured, in other words, there's not sufficient security in terms of the house, and she fears thievery, that her wealth will be stolen. Or alternatively, she finds herself amongst sinners. These are quite real examples. In what sense? You have a person is married, he passes away. So then his wife is left behind. She is staying with her brother-in-laws. So as long as the husband is there, her honor is maintained. If it is such that the husband has passed away and a lady fears for herself, she fears for her honor, that advances may be made on her person from her brother-in-laws, by way of example. In that particular instance, it is permissible for her to leave the marital home. Alternatively, she's in the marital home, her husband is not there. She fears harm from the neighbors, or she fears harm from her in-laws. In those particular instances, she may leave. Alternatively, and our Sharia is just alternatively, you have a daughter-in-law, her husband has passed away, so she's currently with her in-laws, but she lets her tongue loose in relation to her in-laws. She is vile with them. Her tongue is very virulent. She has a harsh tongue. She lets her tongue loose upon them. In that particular instance, the general rule is she cannot be removed, but here they have a license to remove her, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. What on the other hand, if a lady, she's in the waiting period, but she needs to take care of her basic needs. She needs to take care of her basic needs. What are the basic needs in this particular regard? Let me go to the slide here. Barakallahu feekum. She's in the waiting period. She needs to exit to see to her basic needs. Here our scholars are going to say, what type of mu'tadda, lady in a waiting period, are we referring to? If it is a raj'iyya, in other words, a husband has given his wife a single divorce and she's in the waiting period, can she leave to see to her needs? The simple answer is no. Why not? Because she happens to be legally termed as a wife. Legally, she is considered to be a wife. And legally, if she's considered to be a wife, then her maintenance is the responsibility that of the husband. And the husband needs to take care of her, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Here's a bit of detail which I'd like to explain. I've written the Arabic in terms of the slide, inshallah, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our scholars talk about a raj'iyya, that she's like a wife and therefore the husband needs to see to her. So if the husband needs to see to her, then there's no need for her to leave the home to buy food stuff. She may be running a home industry and she needs to sell things. She need not do that. Why? Because the husband needs to take care of her, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. They discuss an issue about what if a lady is in a waiting period, but the waiting period is as a result of a form of ambiguous sexual intercourse having taken place with her. In that particular instance, she is considered like a widower. And the widower we're going to discuss now, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a moment. So let's do that immediately. A lady, her husband has passed on, she's a widower. Alternatively, she had received 3 divorces, by way of example, and now she needs to leave the marital home because she needs to buy basic food stuff, by way of example, or she needs to earn a living. And in that particular instance, as you can clearly see from the slide, that she may leave, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Now, we continue with looking at except when there is a need and what constitutes a need. A lady is divorced, and the type of divorce that we're specifically speaking about would be when she's been given 3 divorces or a khula'. She goes into a waiting period. She must stay there unless there's a need. We are discussing that need now. What is the next need that comes about? If the house is borrowed and the lender wants to retrieve it, so they have to give it back. In that particular instance, they're going to give it back and she's going to spend her iddah elsewhere. Alternatively, if the house is leased and the lease agreement has come to an end, and the owner, the lessor, in other words, he wants the house back, he gets the house back, she has to leave and spend her iddah elsewhere, those all constitute valid reasons for leaving the house and falls under the ambit of need. The next issue talks about the lady has an obligation. What type of obligation is this? It is possible to resolve from home. For example, she owes somebody money. Now she wants to leave to settle a debt, but arrangements can be made that the creditor actually comes to her home and she hands the money over in the comfort of her home. Then she can't leave, it must be resolved as such. What if it's not possible to resolve from home? Here our scholars draw a distinction. The lady in question may be a baraza. In other words, a lady that is used to, she's married, she's used to interacting and engaging in public spaces. For example, the marketplace, the mosque and elsewhere. For such a lady, if it's not possible for the issue to be resolved at home, she may leave, see to the need and come back. Alternatively, you have another type of lady which they refer to as a mukhaddara. Mukhaddara would be a lady who's basically confined to the inner realm, sanctuary of her home. Such a lady, what is going to happen is that we're going to see to her needs, but facilitate for it to happen in the comfort of her home, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. For example, if it's an issue regarding a court case, what would happen in an Islamic judiciary, appreciating the status quo of this particular lady, then the judiciary will come to her as opposed to she going to the judiciary, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We go on to the next case, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Here are certain instances, and this is particularly important. We looked at a lady can leave when there is a need. So in other words, certain instances where she's going to be excused. What are those instances where we're not going to be excused? In other words, where a lady in a waiting period, she's going to be compelled to hang on and remain for the entire waiting period, and this doesn't constitute a valid excuse for her to leave the home, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. What are they? Let's look to the slide, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This reads fairly simple, and we're going to go through them as we go along, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Barakallahu feekum jami'an. So what is happening over here is that instances that are not overlooked. The one instance would be when a lady is not excused. The one instance reads as Ziyaratu Baytil Maqdis wa Quburi Salihin, visiting Jerusalem and visiting the graves of the pious. Whilst it is something which is permissible and in certain instances even recommended, but in this particular instance, since she is in her waiting period, it's not going to be permitted, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. The next reason what we have here in terms of the matn would be ta'jilu hajjatil Islam. A lady, and this is quite an interesting phenomenon for me, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Why am I saying that? Because many times we don't understand the gravity and the importance of a particular ruling. But when it's explained in this particular manner, as our scholars explain to us, we get a sense of the importance thereof. We know that the pillar of Islam is the fifth pillar, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حِجُّ الْبَيْتِ مَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ إِلَيْهِ سَبِيلًا, to perform the Hajj, major pilgrimage. If a lady is in a waiting period and she's in a position whereby her fard Hajj is compulsory upon her, what's going to happen now? Ta'jilu hajjatil Islam. She wants to bring it forward and do it now, whilst she may be able to do it at a later stage. Are we going to say, look, you can stay in your waiting period, or you can bring your fard Hajj forward? Is the fard Hajj reason enough for a lady to exit from her home in terms of the waiting period? Our scholars say no, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. The next issue which we look at there would be istima'ul mal. A lady wants to go out not to care for her basic needs, but to do business, in other words, to grow her business interest as such. That's not going to be permissible. It doesn't cater for an immediate need. The other one would be imara and ziyarah, visitations and so forth, that would not be allowed, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Now, the husband staying with the mu'taddah. Here we also have a very important issue, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I'm going to take out time. I've taken out the time to actually write it down here so we can read through it, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and gain maximum benefit from a verbatim translation of the text, and also understand and appreciate these rulings. What does it read as? It reads as follows. يحرم على الزوج مساكنة المعتدة. Here Taqiyuddin al-Hisni takes a very strong view in this particular regard. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless him for what benefit he has afforded us through his writings. in this particular instance, he takes a very strong position. What is the strong position? He says, يَحْرُمُ عَلَى الزَّوْجِ مُسَاكَنَةُ الْمُعْتَدَّةِ. It is impermissible for a husband to live with the lady whom he has divorced. It is impermissible for him to stay in the same home. Yes, the lady is a wife, but from a certain perspective. From what perspective? The perspective of maintenance. The perspective of the divorcee having to seek the permission of the husband to leave the home. But from another perspective, they are strangers to one another, and therefore it's not permissible for the husband to be alone with the wife. Wallahu a'lam, with his divorcee wife now while she's in the waiting period. Now, لأنه يؤدي إلى خلوة. Why? Because this would lead to them being alone. وخلوته بها كخلوة بأجنبية. And for him to be with her is like being with a strange lady, which is not permissible. وكثير من الجهلة. And yet تقي الدين الحسني in his classical way, what does he say? وكثير من الجهلة. Many ignoramus, many ignorant people, may Allah protect us from ignorance. لا يرون ذلك حراما ويقول. They don't consider it to be impermissible, and the person says, almost like in righteous indignation, يا مطلقتي, it is like my divorcee wife, and emphasis being on the fact that she's my wife, why can't I be alone with her? وهذا يعرف الحال. Now تقي الدين الحسني says this person, he will be informed about the status quo of his being with his wife. It's not permissible, in other words. فإن اعتقد حله, if he believes it to be permissible, بعدما عرف, after he was informed about it, كفر, he will be deemed a non-believer. فإن تاب, if he repents, وإلا ضربت عنقه, otherwise his neck will be cut. This is Taqiyuddin's opinion, and we leave this particular discussion to Islamic theology in terms of when can a person be considered as a non-believer or not. وَكَذَلِكَ حُكْمُ التَّامِينِ. Here Taqiyuddin addresses another phenomenon which is found within society at the time. People who travel for Hajj. So they would travel by camel, by way of example. Whilst traveling by camel, these camels needed to be tended to by a professional camel manager, so to say. In other words, leading the camels, bringing the camels down, unloading the camels, seeing that the camels get disembarked, and so forth. In other words, what we would refer today as a host or hostess in terms of buses, in terms of planes, etc. So, classically, traditionally, those would be referred to as akkamun, assistants, in terms of assisting those ladies that are traveling in terms of their conveyance. So he says the same applies to the ruling of those men who see to the needs of ladies in this particular regard. يَحُجُّونَ مَعَ النِّسَاءِ. They travel in terms of the pilgrimage. لَا يَحِلُّ لَهُمْ الْخَلْوَةُ بِهِنَّ. It is not permissible for them to be alone with the women folk. وَلَا يُقْتَدَى فِي ذَلِكَ بِمَنْ يَفْعَلُ مِنَ الْفَقْهِ. There are certain students or certain scholars who actually do that, but that shouldn't be our example. In terms of Taqiyuddin al-Hisni's argument, our example should be the Quran and the way of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which does not condone such behavior, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We go on to the last slide for today, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it reads as follows. Here we have an issue in terms of مضت مدة من العدة أو كلها ولم تطلب حق السكن سقط. The waiting period has passed by, and the lady in a waiting period, she did not demand the right to accommodation, سقط, then it falls away. وَلَمْ يَصِرْ دَيْنًا فِي ذِمَّتِهِ. It does not become a liability in the seat of responsibility, that of the husband. نَصَّ عَلَيْهِ الشَّافِعِيُّ. Imam Shafi'i has explicitly stated this. I think that's an interesting issue to be familiar with. وَنَصَّ أَنَّ نَفَقَةَ الزَّوْجَةِ لَا تَسْقُطُ بِمُضِيِّ الزَّمَنِ. Imam Shafi'i also explicitly states that the maintenance of the wife, nafaqa, we're not talking about second, we're talking about the nafaqa. The nafaqa la tasqut, will not fall away بمضي الزمان, when the time has passed on. بل تصير دينا في ذمته, but rather it becomes a liability in his seat of responsibility. Why are we mentioning these things? There's a distinction, number one, and I would miss this distinction. That's why I'm highlighting it for you, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah increase you in all goodness, and may Allah grant us beneficial knowledge. There's a difference between sakan and nafaqa. So sakan, the husband is supposed to provide for it. The time period has passed. Can the lady demand that accommodation in retrospect? In other words, fining for it, and he has to pay for it now. The scholars say no. But now, when it comes to nafaqah, a month, a husband hasn't paid nafaqah to his wife. the next month, can she demand the previous month's nafaqah? Yes, she can. What is the difference between the two? We read the text to explain that to us بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى. فقيل قولان والمذهب تقرير نصين والفرق. The madhab is that we're going to establish both these rulings of Imam Ash-Shafi'i. In other words, referring to the nafaqah and referring to the second. There is no contradiction because the one text refers to second and the other text refers to nafaqah. أن النفقة تجب بالتمكين وقد وجد. Nafaqah is binding as a result of the lady availing herself. وقد وجد وسكن لصيانة مائه على موجب نظره ولم يتحقق وحكم السكنى في صلب النكاح كما ذكرنا في العدة. وقد وجد سكنى. Now, لصيانة مائه. And on the other hand, what do we find? That the residence لصيانة مائه is for the protection of his offspring. Let's translate it as first. على موجب نظره, on the basis of his nazar. ولم يتحقق, and that has not been found. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. This brings us to the end of today's lesson. Barakallahu feekum jami'an. Our next lesson is lesson number 132, and we're going to be dealing with issues of breastfeeding bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Till we meet again. Barakallahu feekum jami'an. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.